My name is Dixie, and I'm with the Austin Independent Business Alliance. Thank you all for joining us this morning. It might be afternoon now. I'll say morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. So we have been in the wake of this coronavirus crisis. We have been gathering feedback from our members, trying to provide the best support that we can. And one thing that we have heard is that's a big concern for a lot of people is the commercial lease that they're in. And what does it mean? How do I get out of it? What do I do? How do I talk to my landlord? There's a whole host of questions that go with that. And so we, at AIBA, what we always do is we look to our members to see what resources we have, and our membership is so deep and amazing. And so Rachel Luna is here with us. She has her video on. Rachel Luna is with Luna Law, and she's gonna address some ideas for navigating your lease. She's gonna give us a little kind of primer. You're gonna learn the definitions of some words you probably never wanted to know the definition of. She's gonna walk us through that, some steps that you can take, and then she's gonna talk a little about the moratorium on evictions that exists right now. I probably used that word wrong, sorry, Rachel, but she'll correct everything I said incorrectly. So we're also at the end gonna have a short question and answer session. No guarantees at all that we can answer all of your questions, as anything that in the legal world is. It's all dependent on how the contract is written and yada, yada, yada. So know that going in, but we'll do our best to either answer your questions or to try to point you to some resources where you can get those answers, so that you're not having to shoulder this burden all on your own. So we're super grateful. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us this morning and offering this services. This is huge for everyone that's here. When Rachel is not doing nice things like offering her services to individuals like ours, she runs her own firm here in town. She works with businesses and with creative professionals and just does everything she can to use her expertise to foster their success. So good people, right? So as a reminder, we are recording. Oh, so sorry. Let me mention one other thing. As we're going through here, one thing that is happening at AIBA is we have been contacted by a couple of people at different levels of government, the state government and up and down, who are interested in stories that are happening between landlords and tenants in this crisis. So both amazing things that are happening. If you have a hero landlord, we would love to hear about that. If you have someone who's making life particularly challenging for you, we'd love to hear about that too. Rebecca Melanson, who's on this call, is going to be collecting those for us. And her email address is Rebecca, REBECCA, at ibyaustin.com. So if you have something to share in that regard, we would love to hear it. And she's collecting those for us. I'll repeat that again at the end, and we'll send a little, send the presentation out at the end of this meeting to everyone who joined, and make a note of that in there. I see just a couple more people joining. Hi, everyone who just joined. You should be muted when you come into the meeting. If you're not, I'll let you know. You can choose to show your video or not. So if you do see yourself in the video clip, just know that everyone in the meeting can also see you. I know some people are new to Zoom. So Rachel, I'm gonna hand it over to you, and I'm gonna go ahead and start our presentation.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this morning. I spoke with Dixie last week, and she said that folks had some concerns about commercial leases and kind of gave me some guidance as far as what help might be beneficial to you guys. But if I am missing out on anything or you have additional questions, please do chat them in. And also, this is a little bit out of my comfort zone because I don't have control over the PowerPoint, and Dixie is going to be helping go through that. So I apologize. It's probably going to be a little bit clumsy because of that.
Yeah, forgive us. We're doing the best we can.
But I guess we're ready to get started and go to the next slide. This is just a very not surprising legal disclaimer that we don't really need to spend much time on, but it kind of goes along the lines of what Dixie mentioned earlier. This is general information. Your lease is really going to determine what you can and can't do in this instance. So while I think this information will be helpful for all of you, I would say you need to really look at your lease to see what is going to be allowable or not, as well as be in contact with your landlord. That being said, let's start with your lease. And as you consider your lease, the first thing I'd want you to think about is the Texas Property Code, which governs all commercial leases within the state of Texas. If you're talking about a lease outside of the state of Texas, this presentation probably won't be nearly as helpful for you. But with regard to the state of Texas, the two most applicable provisions in the property code that apply in this instance are laid out on the slide. First, please note that by default, to be evicted from your premises, you would need to go through a judicial eviction process. However, by default, you can also be locked out of your premises. The next provision on the slide shows, though, that your lease language can supersede this default language. So again, we really need to look at your lease. And I want to make sure I'm not going too fast through these two terms, so I just want to explain the difference between the two. A judicial eviction basically is a termination of your lease, the right to be in your property at all. And so that would be something obviously you wouldn't want to happen at all, because in addition to judicial eviction, there can be acceleration of rent and things like that within your lease that would be a very bad thing to happen to any tenant. That is, eviction is pretty much permanent. You're no longer going to be able to be back in your property. Being locked out or having the locks changed is also not great, but a little bit more temporary. And it's something where you can usually still work with your landlord to get back into the premises. Probably everybody here has seen a lockout happen to a business before, when you go out to your favorite restaurant and see that sign on the door. So usually you can still at that point find some relief with your landlord. But the two things that we're going to be focusing on as the most important parts of your lease and what to look for are these two issues. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So when you're looking in your lease, these are the sections you should immediately take a look at. And they can be called different things, but the idea is to look for what would cause a default in your lease, what would cause you to be in violation of your lease is what would be the default, then what remedies your landlord could take if you are in default. Sometimes these sections are merged together, sometimes they're called things like termination. But look, if you can do a word search, look for the words default, termination, remedies. The third provision we're going to look at is lockout. So also sort of take a look for that language, lockout, locked out, things like that will get you to where you need to be. And just as a reminder, the default provisions or the standard provisions per the property code say default in your lease would require a judicial process. You'd have to go to court to be evicted. That's the default standard language. But the default standard language of a lockout is that you can be locked out without, unless your lease says otherwise. And we're going to go through each section a little bit more slowly. All right, so the tenant default section, there'll be something along these lines, will be a list of anything in your lease that would be considered the default of the lease and would generally allow your landlord to evict you. What we're most concerned about at this point is failure to pay rent. Usually it's spelled out there when you need to pay the rent. Sometimes you get a grace period. And I've included some language that I'm not going to read out, but give you a second to kind of take a look at. This is pretty standard language that a lot of commercial leases will have with regard to defaulting under the lease. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there might be some other language in there, such as if you default the lease, it can be immediately terminated and you have to pay accelerated rent for the remainder of the lease. There are provisions like that that I think we should definitely be mindful of, but I do think that for everybody's focus right now, it's just taking a look at what could create a default and making sure that you either stay on making sure that you don't default, or at least be aware of what it is so that you can understand what your next best action is. Then hand in hand with that default language, take a look at the landlord remedies section. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on kind of how you look at it, you can almost contract to do anything. So leases are going to be very, very different. But the idea here is taking a look out for the language as far as what your landlord can do if in fact you're in default of the lease, which will likely happen if you do not pay rent. And what you're really looking for is, has a landlord written the lease, or have you signed a lease where the landlord can come in and evict you without going to court? And this is an example of some language that would allow that. Basically, it says if you're in default, the landlord can evict you, period. And as we saw on the slide with the Texas Property Code language, if that is what your lease says, they do not have to go to court. So be careful when you're looking at this language. A term of art that's often used is self-help, although self-help, and self-help is used in the idea that a landlord can, on their own, go in and evict you without having to go to court. But that's not magic language. It's just sort of the idea of, can a landlord come in and evict you without having to go to court? And so just keep an eye out for any sort of language that would allow that sort of remedy. The next provision we want to talk about is lockouts. Again, just a reminder, by default, the property code allows for lockouts. So what you're looking for is, has there been some language inserted that would prevent your landlord from locking you out? Included here is an example of language that would prevent your landlord from locking you out. This is something that I do think you should take a look at to see if you've got some language that would protect you in that instance. In which case, if you have language that protects you from lockouts, your landlord probably, although I can't guarantee it, probably also would have agreed to only evict you per judicial order. So that would be really great news for you if you can find this language. This language, though, is pretty exceptional. I haven't seen it in very many commercial leases, but it is important just to take a look to see if it might be in your lease. If you cannot find language in your lease that allows your landlord to evict you without judicial process, this is fantastic news. Because if your lease is in Travis County, because the Travis County courts ruled, I think last week, placed an order in the court system that evictions are being postponed until after May 8th of this year. And that's evictions for both residential and commercial. This will only apply, however, I just can't underscore this enough, if your landlord has to go through the judicial process to evict you. If you find language in your lease that says that you can be evicted without judicial process, this order is probably not going to help you. So that's why it's incredibly critical to look into your lease to see what your language says with regard to evictions, as well as lockouts, because while lockouts aren't permanent, if you can't get into your building, obviously that's not going to be too much of a saving grace either. So again, just a really quick summary, look to your lease, see if your lease can, see if your lease allows for your landlord to evict you without process. If not, then you might have some relief through the judicial order that was enacted in Travis County, if your lease is in Travis County, that prevents commercial evictions, at least through May 8th. Here are some other sections and some language in your lease that might be helpful. I don't think they're probably as critical as the language we just went through, but it is something that at some point I think you should take a look at because it might provide you with some relief. First is rent abatement. Leases generally spell out when your rent can be abated, which means when you don't have to pay your rent. Unfortunately, with commercial leases, it's generally very narrowly defined if it's ever allowable. But when you're doing a word search in your lease or when you're looking at the different provisions of your lease, look to see if there's any chance you might be able to postpone or get your rent abated. Force majeure clauses are something very standard in every lease. And basically, those are clauses that forgive performance of a duty when your inability to perform that duty is completely out of your control. For example, hurricanes. That's probably been one of the more common ones in Texas are hurricanes, but there could be other reasons why it's out of your control. And in this case, it could be the governmental order of the city or the state, or it could be the fact that we have a pandemic. Unfortunately, in commercial leases, even when there is a lot of time spent on these force majeure clauses, payment of rent is excluded. So I don't expect there will be a lot of relief for folks with the force majeure clauses, but it doesn't hurt to take a look And one more quick note about force majeure clauses. If you have a business that had an event that had to be canceled, or other types of contracts, force majeure might have a much bigger impact for you there, because a lot of things are not being able to be done right now, as you know, because of something out of your control. So not just in your lease, but be sure to take a look at all of your contracts with regard to this force majeure clause. And then the final provision that you might want to take a look at is the condemnation and eminent domain clause. These typically apply when the government takes property, probably most commonly when the government condemns property because they want that land for some reason or another. There's a debate right now in the legal community whether or not some of the prohibitions that have been coming out by the governments, for example, to close restaurants and bars, would be considered a takings. It's going to be something probably debated for a while, and I don't know that it's going to provide too much relief, but it's something to at least consider as you're looking at your lease to see what that language looks like. Just a couple of things that aren't on there that might be specific to a couple of your businesses are hours of operation clauses. Some, I think especially retail leases, might have requirements for when you have to operate your business, and then common area access clauses where your landlord agrees to give you access to common areas. Just take a look at that language and see if there is any potential violation of those provisions as you think about what sort of communication to have with your landlords. So those are really the big lease provisions that I think you should definitely take a look at. You should look at your full lease, of course, but those are the ones you should definitely take a look at as we're going through and considering how to move forward. That being said, there's a few additional considerations that I think we should all keep in mind. First, authorities are trying to help. For example, the Travis County order that I talked about, where evictions are being halted, not just in residences, but also in commercial leases, I think is incredibly helpful to keep in mind. Additionally, other disaster relief efforts have begun and are being discussed, and we're going to talk about some of those. Dixie mentioned some of them already, but we're going to be talking about some of those towards the end of this presentation as well. I think that everybody knows that this is going to be a hardship for small businesses, and people are really trying to come together to figure out a way to help us through this unprecedented event. And next, this is something a little bit unusual for me, but I think I'm actually going to read through this article that I found online because I think it's just that important. So this all comes from an article that is quoted at is linked at the end of the slide that talks about it, but I just want to read through it because I think it'll help give you guys some ideas as to what's going on, not just with small businesses, but with large businesses with regard to their commercial leases. And I think also give some ideas as to what sort of communication piece to put in place or to what sort of communication to start having with your landlords. So I'm not usually used to reading, but I'm going to read this out because I do think it's that important. Retailers fear that temporary closures to slow the spread of COVID-19 might turn permanent if a drop in sales mean they cannot pay their bills. Most national retailers have already sent letters to their landlords requesting a deferral of rent until June 30th. And with razor-thin profit margins, small retailers may be even more at risk. In response, many landlords are granting temporary moratoriums on rent, a move that could help businesses survive economic disruption. Landlords are largely responding to tenants with flexibility, knowing that this is a no-fault situation, said major landlords and real estate advisors. Landlord groups, and Dixie, it's the next slide. Landlord groups are all having meetings trying to determine how to handle this. More than likely, the landlords are going to go along with it. They will have to in some fashion because tenants simply can't pay rent. Payment arrangements vary, but landlords typically defer payments for 90 days. Some landlords are letting tenants tack payment onto the end of their lease and to be paid at its expiration, while others are setting up systems for tenants to pay off deferred rent incrementally. It is clearly nobody's fault that businesses need to shut down, and at the end of the day, if businesses do not have revenue, they will not be able to pay rent. Because businesses are all in the same situation, evicting a defaulting tenant might simply mean an empty storefront. Real estate investors emphasize that short-term delays on rent are meager compared to the income from long-term relationships. Lease terms are typically for 10 to 15 years. Next slide. And this is the last slide. No landlord wants to lose a tenant unnecessarily. It is important to forge relationships with your tenants. And if landlords are there for their clients now, the tenants will be there for the long term. In the worst case scenarios where landlords are eager to collect rent from retailers impacted by the coronavirus, legal experts agree that judges will be loath to issue evictions. I don't see a lot of judges wanting to throw people out. It's really bad optics putting small businesses out on the street. But for landlords, rent relief is not necessarily as simple as deciding to have compassion. In addition to loss of income, most landlords rely on rent payments to pay for the mortgage on their properties. Without rent payments, landlords could default on their loans, and lenders have not yet issued guidance on mortgage flexibility. The ultimate solution is for the state and federal governments to support lenders through temporary monetary relief or long-term incentives for offering flexible loan payments in order to create a lasting solution that doesn't leave landlords in a difficult position. So again, apologies for reading that full thing out loud, but I think it really just shows everybody, not just small businesses. I think all businesses are suffering and not knowing where to move forward. Lots of large businesses don't know how they're going to pay rent either. It's not just small businesses. And one thing that I think is also important to keep in mind is that as the relief efforts have been coming out, and they've often started with the folks most immediately impacted and working their way up. And by that, I mean, lots and lots of locations have moratoriums on evictions for residences, for example. And I think the next step is to figure out how to help those landlords, because I think that's what was written in here is incredibly true. A lot of landlords depend on rent payments to pay their mortgages. It's not just all profit for them. So I think we just need to keep our eyes open, not just for what's happening to small businesses, but also kind of what sort of relief is being offered through the banks for mortgages, for example, as we move forward in figuring out next steps. And so with that being said, here are the next couple of slides go through a couple of opportunities for small businesses to seek some relief. And I know these have been discussed quite a bit already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but as more information comes out, I do think it's important for everybody to be aware of what that information is. As Dixie mentioned, the Small Business Association disaster loan application process is open. I am a member of a couple of attorney groups, and the word I saw most recently, which was last night, is they are not surprisingly being deluged with requests. So if you haven't started on the process yet, I think you should really, and you're thinking about seeking out a small business loan, I think you should seek out that, or start working on your application sooner rather than later, really as soon as possible. I think their turnaround time I read was 3 weeks. I think that was from the SBA page, but I saw something from the city where they're thinking it might take 4 or 5 weeks. Really, the sooner you get your application in, the better. That being said, and I guess, I don't know, I'm not gonna spend too much time going through the amount offered as well as the interest rates. They're written here for your information. But I do think that next slide, which shows what's required to apply for a small business loan, an SBA loan, is important for you to look at. These documents, these 10 groups of documents were recommended by the governor's website as documents you might want to go ahead and start, you probably should go ahead and start pulling and uploading and scanning in to submit with your application. So one of the things I think everybody needs to be aware of, especially if you haven't applied for an SBA loan before, is it is document intensive. So not only on your side will it take some time to pull together, but on the government's time, it will take some time for them to likewise go through your information and make decisions on whether and how much of a loan to grant, especially given where we are today in a place we've never been before. That being said, and the fact that it might take some time for these loans to get processed, the city of Austin came out on Saturday and announced that they are meeting this week to look at basically a stopgap loan or program, stopgap financial aid program for small businesses in the city of Austin. Don't really know very many specifics beyond what you see here, but it looks like what they're hoping is to provide up to $35,000 for Austin businesses to help them get through the time, make the payroll, pay the rent, et cetera, until the small business loans can be approved. Again, this has not been approved by the city of Austin. I think the meeting is Thursday. If you guys are inclined, it would probably be helpful to have some representation. I haven't even had a chance to talk to Dixie or anybody at AIBA to see kind of what we're doing as a group with regard to these, but I'm sure that they've got a plan in place. So, you know, it's all happening so quickly for everybody, but I do think we should get some comfort and some hope by the fact that as these terrible things are happening to our small businesses, on the other side of the coin, we have the government and other groups such as Facebook stepping up to try to help our small businesses. And we just need to start all working together to accomplish what we need to take advantage of these resources. That being said, let's talk about what I think might be some good next steps for everybody to take. One, review your lease. That is, I think, the most important step for you to take, because your lease is going to really govern what you can and can't do, as well as what your landlord can and can't do. Stay updated with relief efforts for small businesses. It is changing every day, sometimes many, many times per day. And I think that the intent to help small businesses is there, but sometimes these things, I do think if you haven't started working, for example, on your SBA loan, the sooner you can, probably the better off you'll be. So I think staying up to date with them will be very beneficial to you as you move forward to moving along with your business. Apply for relief as appropriate. Start communicating with your landlord. This also, I can't underscore enough. I'm sure your landlord is probably, depending on how many properties they own, it's probably already started communicating with other tenants. I think letting your landlord know kind of where you are and what your thoughts are, and seeing if you can work together and moving forward is in the best interest of both of you. But I would caution to make sure that you don't put anything in, don't communicate anything to your landlord that would put you in default with your lease. So be careful when you review your lease to make sure there isn't any language that would allow your landlord to immediately terminate your lease. You should also contract your insurance broker if you haven't already. There may be some coverage for you with regard to business interruption. Whether or not it applies and will give you relief to your lease is one thing, but there might be other operations as well that might give you some insurance relief. And then obviously let Dixie or Rebecca or anybody at AIBA, as well as myself, know if we can provide you with any further assistance in moving your small business forward. I think that's it.
This is great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Let me just go back to our chat over here. That was a lot of information. I so appreciate you sharing all of it with us. And also, the one big takeaway is that this is a terrifying time, that everyone is in it all together, and that there are organizations, both governmental organizations and other organizations, who are working to provide the support that our small businesses need. AIBA being one of those, working both in the foreground and in the background to try to make sure that we can get you what you need. So if you have a question that you want to ask, you can ask it now in this chat function. I mentioned this at the beginning of our meeting and want to reiterate it here. If you would like to to privately ask a question that doesn't have your name attached to it in the chat box. Instead of sending the message to everyone, you can do the drop down and you can send it directly to me, and I'm happy to read that out loud. So also mentioned at the beginning, Rachel may not be able to, off the cuff, without reading the documents that you have, answer all of these questions, but we can talk about them in general, maybe if we can't give specific answers, and point you to resources either right now live on the call or at the end. I can follow up with you then. So one question that we have, and give me just 1 second to read it before I read it out loud, is about inflation adjustment index, or strategies for the lessee and lessor. So pardon my ignorance, I'm not sure. I'm just going to go ahead and read this out loud, and Rachel, if you can address it, you will, or we'll connect at the end of the call. So best inflation adjustment index or strategies for lessee and lessor. A few years ago, the advice for owners was to never do another lease to buy, since protection skewed to benefit the potential buyer. How does that fold into what's happening with the coronavirus right now?
So
it may not.
yeah, well, I mean, I think unfortunately with COVID-19, I think it's hard to know. I think it's hard to know what's going to change between today and tomorrow, much less what's good long-term advice as far as investments and property values, et cetera. So unfortunately, I don't think that that's something that really could be answered at this point.
Okay, so the question, and like we mentioned, the question maybe we don't know. So is it advisable to still do a lease to buy? We're not sure right now. We don't know how the whole thing is going to play out. So let me ask another question. As a registered LLC, if I abandon my lease, am I personally responsible?
So a lot of that is, I'll say this, a lawyer's favorite answer is it depends. And so it depends. You would need to look to your lease to see who are the parties in the lease. Is it the LLC? Is it the LLC and the person? Did the person personally guarantee the lease? So there's going to be lease provisions you're going to need to look at. In addition to that, you're going to need to look at the formalities that you've kept in place with regard to your LLC. Do you ever mingle funds between your private account and your LLC account? Things of that nature. Are you keeping formalities up? So if your LLC has structured properly and you've respected formalities, and the lease otherwise doesn't have some language that would allow it, you should be protected. But I'm saying this very generally, you need to have somebody take a look at your lease and discuss with you kind of the steps that you've taken to protect those formalities. Okay,
so as a possibility, the LLC would give you some personal protection depending on how things are set up and how you've been operating. And I'll mention this at the end, but we do have some offers that you can do, a quick 30 minutes, somebody can answer maybe specific questions while you can read, parts of your lease or parts of your formation paperwork. So the person who asked that question, I will connect you with someone after the call. Here's another question. If an attorney and tenant group together has plans to go to the local and national media if the landlords are not being reasonable, what are your thoughts on contacting the media as a tenant group or even as an individual about your landlord being unreasonable, being unwilling to work with you?
Well, my initial strategy is always try to work with your landlord. I think that you guys at this point are still on the same side. You've entered a contract together, you've had a relationship together. Try to work it through with your landlord. If you try to work it through with your landlord and the landlord is being unreasonable, I think sometimes the media does provide some relief, and I think it's already being used with some instances of, I've seen it already being used with some instances of potential residential eviction threats and used successfully. So I think it sounds like you're working with a lawyer to get that done. So I think your lawyer can definitely give you really good counsel on moving forward. But I do think it could be beneficial.
I wonder, is there any standard language that you know of in a person's lease that says you can't do this, you can't speak publicly?
So the law allows you to contract for almost anything.
Mhm.
So I think it's entirely possible. I
Okay.
have not seen language like that.
Okay, not standard. Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Some cities in other states are banning evictions. Does Austin have the power to do that? And this is talking about protection for tenants' leases that do not require going to court. So kind of that first thing that you talked about where you don't have the option to get evicted in court.
Right. I've seen that also, and I think that's an excellent question and something I probably didn't um, explain very well earlier when I was talking about it. I think that there will likely be litigation as we work through COVID-19 from landlords against municipalities as with regard to whether or not they legally could have done that. So can Austin do that? I think they probably can, but will they be facing potential liability afterward? I think possibly, maybe even probably. So I suspect, I mean, and I'm not saying that I don't think people really know at the end of the day how the courts would rule in this case. This is such an exceptional situation that frankly, we've never seen before, at least not in the not in American jurisprudence. So I think that cities and counties and states that are taking steps like that, I think it's great and gives a lot of peace of mind to business owners, but I also can see why some might be more reluctant than others. And I have no idea because I haven't talked to anybody at the city of Austin about this, but it might explain why they are taking steps such as offering these short-term gap loans instead of, which maybe they're thinking about doing it here too, I really don't know, but it might be why they're thinking about offering these short-term gap loans in addition to or instead of taking action like that. So, I mean, can they do it? They can, but they might be opening themselves up. So I don't know that they will.
Okay. I thank you for answering that. I think that answers that question. We'll wait just a few more minutes for anyone else who has a question. I want to remind you that the chat is at the bottom of your screen. You can choose to send a question to everyone and I will read it out loud and we can get it answered. You can also choose to send a question privately. Just choose my name. My name is Dixie. Choose my name from the chat, type it in and I'll read it out for you. I don't see any other ones on there right now and I checked my email real quick. So it looks like we have one. So quick, David, to answer you, yes, we will email a copy of this PowerPoint to everyone who attended today. We've also recorded this and we'll post it on our YouTube channel and send that out to everyone so that you can listen to the conversation that we had as well. Here's a quick question, Rachel. My lease has a tenant listed as my name, an individual, DBA, my company name. Does that mean that I'm personally responsible for my rent, period?
As you've described it, it sounds like yes.
Okay.
Again, I hate saying this,
right.
but you really should have somebody look at it. But
right.
As you described it, it sounds like yes.
Okay. It looks like the answer to that question is yes, with the caveat that have someone look at your lease. Maybe there are other provisions later on in the document that make it more clear.
Yeah, and please have somebody look at your lease. Okay. I think it would be very beneficial to you.
Okay. What about the idea of using a security deposit that was paid at the beginning or during the beginning part of the lease towards rent?
Yeah, most leases will say you can't do that. But again, kind of part of the reason why I took the time to read through 2.5 slides worth of information from a news article is because I think people are being crafty. People are trying to figure out how to work together. So regardless of what your lease says, I think it doesn't hurt to at least propose that. Okay.
So yeah, and a real theme here is, and both in the information that we're hearing from other cities and states, and also that we're hearing from you, and we're hearing from other people who work in the industry, is to have a conversation with your landlord. A big first step is they know what's happening. No one has their head in the sand so much that they don't understand what's happening. So getting that conversation started. Let me ask you another question we have here. Do you have any advice for someone who has a landlord who is not taking coronavirus or COVID-19 seriously?
I don't that's a broad, can we get a little bit, I don't know, I don't
We can
really
try to get
understand
a
kind of
little
what you're
bit more
asking.
information. I would
Yeah.
guess, and I'm just guessing here, someone who is not providing, not giving provisions in common areas, not cleaning common areas, maybe. Again, I'm just making this up while we wait for some clarification. Or maybe even a landlord who's saying, it's not that big of a deal, don't care. If you decide to close, it's because you decided to close. I don't. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So if it's the first situation where the landlord isn't providing any sort of protections in the common areas, I would recommend writing a letter to your landlord spelling out the concern, and you can go to the CDC. I think it's in the CDC website that has recommendations for property owners, or at least for employers, that I think you can mimic with regard to requesting that your landlord take this more seriously to protect folks that come onto the premises. If it's the second situation where the landlord's not taking seriously whether or not you need to shut down. I mean, the government is shutting down in different and various streams of businesses and kind of in phases, and kind of looking at what's happened recently. I mean, I think probably everybody in this call is at least wouldn't be surprised, I would say, if Austin or Travis County issues a lockdown. So I mean, you could write a letter to your landlord now, or quite frankly, you might want to wait a day or two to see what happens. I know Dallas County issued a lockdown yesterday. Harris County made an announcement this morning where I think a lot of people expected that they were going to lock down, and they decided not to, and stated that they weren't locking down now, but I think they said something along the lines of, we might, reconvene later today. So if they're not taking it seriously now, I'm surprised, but I think things are changing so frequently. You can start the communication now as to why they need to take it seriously, or wait a day or two and see what happens. I mean, on the flip of that, I think I read earlier that the President Donald Trump is looking at what's happening to the economy and thinking about, whether or not to relax some of the measures that are being taken when his 14, 15-day recommendations end. So, I mean, it might very well flip the other way. I don't think it hurts to start all these communications now, but if you were to wait a day or two, it might become a little bit clearer cut one way or the other.
Okay, thank you. So it got word that we did answer the question as it was intended. So that's great.
Okay.
Quick question here. Will it make a difference if the city requires businesses to close, AKA a shelter in place and not leaving the house, working from home? Will that change I guess, will that change your legal standing with your landlord?
No.
Okay.
Unfortunately, no. The lease is going to really determine what the obligations are from each of the parties. Absent kind of what was requested or asked about earlier with regard to if the city or the county were to put a moratorium on evictions with or without judicial process, I mean, you're still going to have that obligation. That's why it's so critical, I think, to start talking and communicating with your landlord now.
Okay, fantastic. We'll wait just a few more minutes if anyone else has questions. I know I've said this, sorry to keep reiterating, but make sure everyone was listening when I said it. If you want to ask a question, you're welcome to ask in the chat. You can ask the whole group, or you can choose my name and ask me privately, and I'll read the question out loud. If it's more comfortable to have your identity protected, that's totally fine. The part of that last question was, and I know we don't have the answer to this. It looks like part of the last question was, will it make a difference? I'm not sure if the question was, will it make a difference to the spread of the virus if business is closed? We don't know the answer to that. We can only follow CDC guidelines and the best practices that are outlined for us. Let me just see real quick. We have, make sure I didn't miss any of these questions at the top. Oh, we got a thank you. So thank you very much, Rachel. I'm glad that this was helpful for so many people. It is, as we wait for a few more questions, I'll just go ahead and talk about one thing that is happening with everyone is this is a very scary time. This is a scary time to just be a human, and it's also a very scary time to be a business owner. There's always a lot of uncertainty. In this particular situation, it's just taken what little bit of certainty we have about our lives and just blown it out of the water. So huge amount of uncertainty. I want to reiterate, if you have any other questions, please do type them. I'm going to go ahead and close out. I want to say a few more things. We've got, so this is the third webinar that we've done. Thank you all for joining us for this one today. The first one we did was a business strategy session with a business coach. And that one is on our YouTube channel. It's about 11 steps that you need to take. It was very, it was informative and hopeful, and really I left, and I know a lot of other people who watched it with us left feeling like they could go and do something, which is a big deal right now, to feel like you can actually do something. We also hosted Caroline Valentine of Valentine HR, who talked about managing employees. If you do have employees, and when business is slow like it is right now, what do I do with them? Do I do furloughs? Do I do layoffs? What can I do? Can I take someone's temperature? That whole thing. We will probably have another one of those. What's happening is, as Rachel mentioned, and I'm sure you all know, things are just moving so quickly. As soon as we type something up and put it up on the website, it has changed. And so in the world of HR, that is particularly true. Things are changing rapidly. Also in, with the what help is available for people out there. So we have another one of those planned. This is our third. This was about lease negotiations during coronavirus. So we've got this, and then we have a couple more in the works. I'm not sure what topics we're going to settle on first, but we are kind of gathering information. So if there is another big thing that we are not touching on yet that is keeping you up at night, more than anything else is, please send me an email. You'll have my email address. I'm going to communicate with everyone after the meeting so we can get an expert to come and talk to us about it. We have a couple of things at AIBA. We have some public campaigns that we're doing where we're talking directly to consumers. It's part of our mission here is to get as many people shopping locally as we can, and that still stands. So that locals need you. That is a big thing that we're doing, making sure that people know that now more than ever is the time to spend their money at local businesses, especially people who are still able to work, who are not in the service industry. The money you were going to use to go out, you can order takeout or you can buy gift cards. There's online shopping. In that vein, we created, with huge props to Rebecca, it was a real heavy lift. We created a local serves you list. You can find that on our website. You can link to it from our homepage, iBuyAustin.com. And there was more than one list that we saw with restaurants, which restaurants are open and how they're delivering. And we hadn't yet seen anything for all of the rest of the local businesses that exist in Austin. Your dog groomers and your liquor stores and your accountants and everyone who is still in business and has modified the way that they do business in light of what's happening in the world. So it's a fantastic list. It's out there right now. If you are a business owner, I assume you are because you're here on the call with us, and you are not yet listed there, there's a quick register button. You fill out a quick survey and we can get you listed there. And we're sharing that just as far and wide as we can. So as you continue to do business, in the different ways that we're all doing it, we can tell people that you're open, or if you've decided to close, we can tell them that you're closed. If you are doing curbside delivery, if you're selling gift cards, whatever it is that you're doing, put your name on there so that we can tell everybody about it. And one last before we go, this was about leases, and we have been asked from multiple sides to share stories of what is happening between you and your landlord. And I mentioned at the beginning, we're looking for stories of if your landlord is a hero and has taken the tact from the Arkansas landlord who said nobody has to pay rent. That would be amazing to hear. We'd love that. If you're having a particularly challenging time with your landlord, either they are not taking the virus seriously, or they are driving just a really hard line and being unwilling to work with you. If you have a story like that you want to share, Rebecca is collecting those stories for us. Rebecca at iBuyAustin.com. You can email her. If you don't mind having your name and business name used in those, that's fine. If you prefer that your identity not be connected with the story, that's also fine. Just tell her very clearly in the email that you send to her, I do not want to be identified, but I do feel like this is a story that should be told. So collecting those stories as relief is coming down, as the people who are working on that at the state and city level are going to talk to people about what should we do next, having those stories in their back pockets to talk about this is what's really happening on the ground will be fantastic. I think that is it for today. Rachel, thank you so much for sharing your time with us, for preparing that presentation, for hand-holding our way through that legal language. A long time ago, I think I thought I might be a lawyer, and I so appreciate the people who actually got there, because it was definitely not my calling. You were fantastic. Thank you so, so much.
Sure. And I just want to add one more thing. During this process, what I've been trying to do for both individuals as well as small businesses is offer my services pro bono to the extent that I can, depending on the scope of the project, at a discounted COVID-19 rate, which is pretty significantly discounted.
Good.
So if you need help, you can reach out to me and we can figure out what might make the most sense. And if I can do it pro bono, I assure you that I will, because I don't feel right. You guys are making tough decisions between paying employees and paying rent. I really, truly want to help you guys.
Thank you so much. That idea is just so heartwarming that there are people, the one takeaway I would love everyone to have from this call, that there are people who are on the front lines and who are working to keep small business solvent. We're doing everything that we can. Rachel is one of those people. If you need to reach out to her, please do. If you need resources, other resources that you're having trouble getting connected with, please also reach out to us. We had a question, will you give your contact information? Yes, I'm going to email the presentation along with the link to the YouTube site and the local Serves You website that we're looking for, to everyone who participated in the call today. So thank you very much. I'm gonna let you guys go. We're finishing just a few minutes early. Have 5 minutes to yourself before your next meeting. I am Dixie. Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you guys have a great day.